I was 6 years old when I first became aware of being real afraid of nuclear war. I lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and I used to play outside a lot, and pretty much alone, because most of the kids in my neighborhood went to school. And I remember the fire raid drills at there was an fire station down the street from our house that had not fire drills, but air raid drills that they would do from time to test the system. And I remember the first time I ever heard it, running home as fast as I could and being really scared and asking my mother what was that noise, and her telling me that it was in case the Russian planes came, that people could do something. And from then on, that fear has always been with me.
There was a lot of news that everybody should build a fallout shelter, and you know, our family didn't have money to build a fallout shelter, but there was one person in the neighborhood who did, and I always wondered if there'd be enough room for all of us, and it just didn't seem fair, you know, that one family could be saved, and you know, it was up to each family to build their own shelter. And you know, I felt kind of helpless back then, and now when I read about the provisions that the government's making for the people to save themselves, it still seems pretty ridiculous.
I grew up in Ireland, and there was no awareness of nuclear power there. We had no power station, even though there were power stations in England just across the water, even one of the most devastating kind of fast breeder reactors. But people in Ireland didn't know about it. So when I first heard about it, it was when I came to America, and I learned how devastating and how destructive they could be, weapons, nuclear weapons.
When I was around 8, my father started to put together some things to put down cellar. He put some sterno and some canned foods and some water bottles, and he was doing that in case that there was ever a nuclear war, we would be able to go down cellar and survive. And I remember how scared everyone was, and thinking about what it would be like to have to live down cellar for how many months or years. And I remember thinking how amazed I was that my father could get it together to put that stuff down, because it took him about 2 years before he even fixed the bathroom door. So I knew that they must have been really scared.
I think I became very conscious of the nuclear threat when I was in Hiroshima. It was late in my life, but I was absolutely flabbergasted when I visited the museum that shows how the city had been completely leveled. And the memory of those pictures and of that museum are still very, very strong in my mind. Also, talking to my father-in-law, who is Japanese and who almost was in Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped. My son is half Japanese, and I guess all this makes it very vivid in my mind.
Good evening, and welcome to Dead Air Live. Many of us still have Memorial Day in our minds. Last night I spent Memorial Day on Long Island watching a show that people in Somerville may or may not have seen, I don't know, but it's called All Quiet on the Western Front. And I was horrified at the tale that it presented of life during World War I. I think many people have become interested in alternative methods of solving conflict from war, having seen that film and many others that have been put out more recently. Tonight we have a show which we are very pleased to present to the people of Somerville, and eventually we hope to people all over this country. We are going to talk about the Women's Encampment for Peace and Justice, which is going to happen this summer, starting on July 4th and going through Labor Day in upstate New York at the Seneca Army Depot. Now, some of you watching the show will have already heard about the Women's Encampment, as people call it, and to others of you it will be new information. We're going to try to present as much information as we can tonight, but basically I'm not going to do it. My guests are, because we have some wonderful people here tonight to tell you about the international importance of the Women's Peace Encampment and also the national and local levels. First, we're going to start with the international to get it in context. And in the studio I have, sitting at my left, Carol Bellum, who's a person from Boston who's just spent 10 months in Europe. She started by going on the march to Moscow. When it reached Boston, went overseas. And on my right, Nancy Alec, who's just come back from 6 months in Europe. And both of these women have a lot to say about what's happening in Europe that we never hear about. Who'd like to jump in?
Well, Martha, I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got over to Europe. I was working in Cambridge for a number of years as a media person, in fact, and every morning before I went to my job, I had breakfast and read the newspaper. And a little over a year ago, I was so disturbed by what I was seeing in the newspaper, the headlines reading that Reagan was talking about having a limited nuclear war. And I became really worried that we were getting into a situation where we could possibly have a nuclear war, and thought, well, I don't know what I can do about it. But I decided as a media person, one of the things I could do about it was to try to talk to people and record and take photographs of people who were trying to find a solution to the problem. And so when I heard about this peace walk, I decided to join them and try and bring some of these images back.
And what is your media work? What kind of media person are you?
Well, I'm trying to make a film about this peace walk to Moscow, a group of people that will be going into the Soviet Union, and I hope to bring back some images, some visual images of life in the Soviet Union, because it seems like we are so unfamiliar with each other, and that's a lot what's really at the bottom of this problem, is that this fear, that's unfamiliarity.
So you're planning to go back over and join the march to Moscow again?
Yes, I hope to go back in a couple of weeks, and the group will be walking into Czechoslovakia on June 28th.
Great. Now you two met in Europe, didn't you, Nancy?
Yes, we both actually had lived in Boston before going to Europe, and we had both worked with the Women's Pentagon Action, but had never met, had talked on the telephone, and we met at an international conference of grassroots peace activists in West Germany, and then connected up a number of other times while we were in Europe together.
Well, what is happening in Europe?
Well, there's a lot happening in Europe. From my perspective, I walked across Western Europe, walking about 20 to 25 miles a day, and talking with people all along the way. And this was such a powerful experience. Walking through Europe, you see a lot of what happened in World War II. You can see the reconstruction. You can see churches were left that are bombed out as a memorial to what happened in World War II, and you can feel that the people in Europe really fear this situation, that their land is going to be the stage for a nuclear war, and they don't want to accept this.
I think that particularly since the NATO decision in December of 1979 to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe, the peace movement there has really grown, and people are really determined that these missiles will not arrive in Europe. I was really struck by how determined people are and how sure they are that the missiles will never come there, because they're just absolutely determined. And ordinary people have sort of taken the initiative. One day they just decide that they have to do something. The Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in England was started by a group of housewives who left their homes in Wales and marched to Greenham Common because they just felt that they needed to do something to stop the deployment.
Well, can you fill us in and tell us what is Greenham Common and how long has it been going on? And
Sure. The Greenham Common Air Base is one of the proposed sites for the cruise missiles, which will be placed in Great Britain. The other is Molesworth, which is another base. And the women that marched there, this peace march that I just mentioned, went there almost 2 years ago, and have maintained. When they arrived at Greenham Common, they received very little attention and decided that they would stay, and have remained there and had a women's peace camp there ever since. And in fact, it was the first peace camp, and has inspired a lot of other peace camps, both women's peace camps and mixed peace camps throughout Europe.
One of the things that is so incredible about what's going on in Europe is that there's a lot of spontaneity. People are just are taking action, and they don't necessarily know what the answer is to the problem, but by doing one small thing, one part of it, people are finding a way to figure out what the answer is. Being part of the process of making a peace camp, for instance, it just opens up your life and your perspective to the realities of the militarization that we're living with, the threat that we're living with, and then working and struggling together how to build a different the life that we want.
When the NATO vote was taken, did all the countries in Europe agree? Do you know if all the countries in Europe agreed that nuclear weapons would be deployed in Europe?
Well, in Belgium and in Holland, they still haven't officially ratified the decision, but it's expected that they will accept the missiles, except for the fact that the people in those countries will refuse them.
So on a government level, the agreement has been made, but there's a grassroots movement among people to protest that.
Right. It's also true that the NATO decision was made by, I mean, there are certain countries that are NATO members, but when that decision was made, it was not put before the parliaments of those countries at that time. I mean, since then, clearly the government in Great Britain, for example, you know, Margaret Thatcher is all for the deployment of the missiles. But there have been polls that show, for example, in Great Britain, that more than 50% of the people of the country do not want the missiles there. And in Sicily, for example, there's a base in Comiso in Sicily where cruise missiles will also be deployed. And it seems pretty clear that the people in that town, the majority of the people in that town, don't want the missiles placed there either.
Now, what's so critical about Sicily? I've been told that putting missiles into Sicily changes the balance of what's happening in Europe. Can you expand on that a little?
Sure.
Well, I'd just like to say one of the things our government says is that we're deploying these missiles as a deterrent against the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's missiles. Well, I think this reveals the falsity of that statement. By placing missiles on Sicily, those cruise missiles are not going to reach anything except a small section of southwestern Russia. Where they are deployed, that will give the U.S. military 1,500 miles deeper range into the Middle East. So these are very strategically placed weapons, I believe not for deterrence, but as a possible interventionist force.
Well, can you talk about first strike, and what does first strike mean? Because I think a lot of times people hear these phrases and it takes a while to understand what they mean. What's the difference between defensive nuclear weapons and first strike nuclear weapons?
It's a whole different way of, I mean, it's a whole new step in terms of the nuclear arms race, because rather than having weapons which are for our defense, supposedly, these are, you know, clearly to be used for the offense.
We could start by telling you about the Cruise and the Pershing missiles. The Cruise is it's a small pilotless plane that's about 20 feet long, and it can fly underneath undetected by radar. The Pershing II has a very deep range, and it will penetrate into the Soviet Union within 4 to 6 minutes. And both of these weapons, it also has an accuracy within 100 yards of its target. So by deploying both of these weapons, it could make the Soviet Union put their weapon system on a launch-on warning, which could mean that if there was some flicker on the computer screen or something, and they thought possibly that this was a cruise missile being launched, that they would then launch their own barrage of missiles at us. And that's what a first strike is about, for one.
Now, I've also heard tales that these missiles, although they're supposedly so accurate, are failing a lot of their tests. I mean, I've been a teacher for a number of years, and a student who gets less than 50% on a test fails, and I've heard that these missiles are failing more than half the time. Are people in Europe able to read in the newspaper and hear on the radio and see on television information about the peace camps?
The peace camps in Europe.
Right.
To some degree, I think Greenham Common has really, it took a long time, but eventually Greenham Common started getting more and more media attention. And in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 months, there's been quite a bit in the papers about Greenham Common. I think that certainly within Europe, although it's made up of many different countries, it's obviously much easier for them to get information about what's happening in each of those countries than it is for them to hear about what's happening in the United States.
And why don't we hear about what's happening in Europe? How many people know that there are these peace camps going on?
very few.
Yeah, there is a real breakdown in the communication, and well, part of that is what my work, I hope to do with my work, is to bring you some
Right.
images of
I
it.
think though that clearly the media in this country is run by big business by and large, and I think that they have a stake in keeping quiet about not only the peace movement in Europe, but the peace movement in this country. There's not, it's pretty hard to get media coverage here unless it's something really, really major, like last year on June 12th when there were nearly 1 million people in Central Park demonstrating against the nuclear arms buildup.
Carol, you've taken a lot of pictures in Europe, haven't you?
Yeah.
And you have a slideshow ready to show us now about what's happening in Holland and Greenham Common in England and in Sicily too?
Yes,
Great.
You'll see all
Good.
of those.
Well, do you want to
Okay,
go
sure.
get onto the
Okay.
button and we'll
Yeah.
go to the slideshow.
On December 12, 1979, NATO defense and foreign ministers agreed to deploy 572 cruise and Pershing II missiles in Great Britain, Italy, West Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. This decision has been the catalyst for the rapid growth of the European disarmament movement. Many Europeans recognize that once the U.S. missiles are sighted, their governments will have little or no control over them. They are alarmed by the talk of Europe as a theater for a limited nuclear war. Thus, disarmament groups often include on their agendas the demand that their country pull out of NATO.
Millions of people have been mobilized in the effort to stop the deployment. Massive demonstrations swept across Europe in the fall of 1981. 150,000 protested in London, 200,000 in Rome, 500,000 in Amsterdam. Over 300,000 in Bucharest, Romania, protested both the Soviet and the U.S. arsenals. On June 10, 1982, over 300,000 people marched into the small capital city of Bonn, West Germany, to protest President Reagan's visit. More than 700 people from 20 countries marched for 2 weeks past the numerous military installations on the island of Sicily to protest the stationing of 112 cruise missiles there. The Danish group Women for Peace is one of a wide range of groups that work together during peace weeks, which are observed in countries across Europe.
A new wave of feminist activism is emerging, changing the face of the peace movement. Women from all walks of life are taking to the streets, bringing into the open an awareness of the threat of nuclear war. The first peace camp began when a small group of women, mainly housewives, marched from Cardiff, Wales to the airbase at Greenham Common, England, in the summer of 1981. These women have maintained a presence for peace outside the gates for almost 2 years, living under great hardship, despite 3 attempts to evict them. Their persistence and courage has inspired women to take action all over the world.
On December 12, 1982, 30,000 women encircled the 9-mile perimeter of the base. 30,000 women stepping out of their daily lives, realizing that risks must be taken to put an end to the insanity of the nuclear arms race. When they left, the fence was covered with symbols and images of their hopes and fears. On the following day, the base was shut down as 2,000 women blockaded all 16 entrances.
Following the initiative of the Greenham women, a group of 100 Dutch women made plans for a peace camp. On May 24, 1982, the tents were raised outside the fences of the U.S.-Dutch Air Base in Soesterberg, Holland. The day was celebrated as International Women's Day for Disarmament, and the camp continued to be a focal point for women's peace work throughout the summer.
During this time, organizing plans were underway for an international anti-militarist march in Sicily. On Christmas Day 1982, the 2-week-long march left Catania with the destination of the U.S. Air Base in Comiso. Upon arrival, yet another peace camp began. A constant international presence from places as far away as Japan stands witness to the fact that we do not give our consent to the deployment of first-strike weapons.
With only months left until the missiles are due to arrive in Europe, Direct action has proven necessary, and a campaign of civil disobedience has taken hold. On January 1, 1983, the news spread quickly that 44 women had carried their protest inside the fences at Greenham Common. Upon hearing this, over 100 people spontaneously climbed over the walls of the base at Comiso. Despite Italy's history of violent struggle, the new disarmament movement remained disciplined and committed to nonviolence.
Intensified by the traditional patriarchal culture of southern Italy, a need was felt by women to work together in an affinity group. During an evening when women shared experiences from each of their countries, slides were shown of weaving a web of life at the Women's Pentagon action. Later, the web entangled the main gates at Comiso. At one point, an Italian soldier gave a gesture of support by passing the wool back to the women through the bars.
Rising before dawn the next morning, the Women's Affinity Group took stronger action and blockaded the construction work. As the workers arrived for the morning shift, they were stopped by a line of women linking arms across the road. The workers piled out of their cars and began arguing the issue. They told of how the mafia has control of much of the construction business in the area. Since the decision to enlarge the base, all other possibilities for work have been closed down. Repeatedly, attempts were made to break the blockade. Police and truck drivers drove slowly into the line of women. A small group of men supporters forced one truck to a halt by jumping under the wheels as it steadily rolled forward. From their own labor struggles, Italian workers recognized the need for unity. After seeing the strength and determination of the women's action, a large group of workers showed their solidarity by thanking the women for their presence as they turned around and went home.
We must remember that each of us can make a difference, that each small gain becomes a part of the larger struggle. As the Greenham women say, there will be no missiles sighted here because we will not let them come. The women's encampment at the Seneca Army Depot this summer will be making a vital link with women in Europe and throughout the world who are demanding an end to the violence in our lives.
Well, I think that all of us are very impressed by seeing those slides and getting a feeling that there are so many hundreds of women who are leaving their homes in Europe and deciding that no matter what their own governments are saying and no matter even what their husbands are saying, it is never again going to happen in Europe, and they're going to stop it. I have now with me on set at my left Suzanne Sawinski, who is from upstate New York and has done a lot of organizing there, but is now living in Boston and is a person who's on the national level of organizing the Women's Encampment for Peace and Justice. And on my right, Karen Clay, who's going to talk to us about the Third World Women's Caucus and issues that arise in any kind of movement like this as far as how they connect with people of color and maybe what kinds of barriers people of color feel in joining in to movements that get started by white women or white people. So I'm very happy to have you on set now. And Suzanne, how about we start with you? And Suzanne was just telling me I've made a mistake in calling it Seneca Falls, and I stand corrected. Would you like to say that?
Sure. A lot of people connect the Seneca Army Depot with Seneca Falls. Seneca Falls is actually about 40 miles from the Seneca Army Depot. And it brings right down close to home the point that the Seneca Army Depot is located in a very, very rural part of upstate New York. The closest town, it's located in the town of Romulus, which still has a total of, I think, 15,000 people in it. It's not a very large town. But Seneca Falls is still a good distance from the Seneca Army Depot. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Women's Peace Camp in the United States, how it got started. I want to mention that the idea came as an international gesture of solidarity with the European peace movement, especially with the women's peace camps. Nancy talked earlier about the June 11th and June 12th, the June 12th demonstration in New York, and on June 11th there was an international women's meeting on disarmament where feminists from all over the world got together, and the idea for the U.S. Women's Peace Camp really grew out of there. There had been an earlier demonstration by women at the Seneca Army Depot that groups that I had been working with in upstate New York, the Upstate Feminist Peace Alliance, had planned May 15th of last year. And we had had about 350 women, which for that part of upstate New York was a pretty large chunk of women to come to that first women's demonstration. Some of those women were at the International Meeting on Disarmament and said, you know, why don't we try having this peace camp? Women's International League for Peace and Freedom got interested in the idea, as did the women's program at AFSC. And so last summer, some women from those two groups came up and met with some of us in upstate New York and said, what do you think of the idea of having a women's peace camp at Seneca Army Depot? Well, at that time, we had just finished organizing, and we thought, well, yes, we want to continue to put attention on the Seneca Army Depot. Not only is the neutron bomb there, that's what we had organized first around, but we had found that the Pershing II missiles were going to be, because Pershing II missiles are an Army weapon, they'll also be stored at the Seneca Army Depot, or at least the component parts of the missile are probably already there. And we began to organized the first women's peace camp. At the time, we had absolutely no idea that the peace camp was going to be as big as it is. And I really think today, if the women in upstate New York had known that that many people were going to become involved in the women's peace camp, that we might just have said no at that point. In the meantime, I've moved to Boston, and I've been working here on the Boston level organizing, and just from the kind of participation, our initial meeting in Boston had 75 women at it. And if that's happening at Boston, it's incredible. We've had like 2 busloads of women from Minneapolis who are saying, we're coming, where can we stay? And women from Germany have written to us already and said that they're going to come.
I just wanted to add, there'll be a walk of women are walking from Durham, North Carolina up to the depot. This Monday there's a march leaving from Boston to the depot.
This Monday. Where would a
This
person
Monday.
call to find out about that if someone watching this show wanted to walk? Is it from Concord, or is that
It's
a
actually
separate?
leaving from Boston from the State House at 8 o'clock, and it will be at Draper Labs in Cambridge at 9 o'clock.
And who would someone call who wanted to know about that? Do you know?
Has a lot of information on that. In fact, people at the office, for most general information around those facts of events, should have, will be able to tell people about that.
Right. Well, I believe we have the number of the Women's Peace Encampment office, and I hope the people who are in the control room will flash up that number.
Right.
Well, Karen, can you tell us a bit about the Third World women's perspective on the peace camp?
Well, I can't speak for all Third World women. I will try and speak for, as far as what has been happening and how it even got started, that there was a particular Third World Women's Caucus, and why was it started. Originally, the Women's Encampment was called the Women's Encampment for Peace, and a number of Third World women got together. When I talk about Third World women, I'm talking not only black women, I'm talking about Hispanic women, and also Native American women. Got together and said that if anything's going to be changed in this country, dealing with militarism and the way of dealing with the world through a militaristic way, it has to be through military and racism. Both have to be combated at the same time. And to be any sort of effective movement, the movement has to deal with racism. So what was added on to the name of the Peace Encampment was a Women's Encampment for Peace and Justice. And what has continued is trying to incorporate issues of women of color into the disarmament movement. Women of color have been involved, has been very instrumental in peace movements throughout time, ranging from Harriet Tubman in northern New York and the Underground Railroad, Moses of her people considered, and also the Iroquois women in upstate New York once again. And
can you say a little bit about the Iroquois women? Because I think a lot of people haven't heard about that.
A little bit. I'm going off on a tangent here. I've been trying to, as part of the Third World Women's Caucus, trying to write an extended article on the role of women of color through the peace movement. Again, focusing on Harriet Tubman and the Iroquois women. Talking with a woman up in upstate New York of the Onondaga Indian School, she said, well, I just don't want to focus, I don't think you should focus on just one particular event that Iroquois women did. Iroquois women have had a strong stance within the tribe throughout time, and we've always been involved in making decisions. So I think that you should write about as far as the involvement of women throughout time in the tribe rather than one particular time, which is correct, and so I will focus on that. There has been some involvement throughout as far as with Native American women, which again has been very strong. Going about the events, what will be happening, focusing particularly with the Third World Women's Caucus, will be getting women of color once again up to the encampment, women with a vision who will speak about issues relating to the economy as far as jobs, connecting with disarmament. Also a walk through the Underground Railway stations in upstate New York. There will be a particular walk during the encampment time that has not been, the date has not been set yet, but within the future, if people are interested, can call the office and we will be able to get more information out to them through that way. I'd just like to say a bit more about jobs and disarmament. When we talk about the militaristic budget, and with the defense budget, every time it's raised $1 billion, 9,500 women lose jobs, okay? 11,000 people, you know, no matter what color, lose jobs, and which includes 1,300 blacks, okay? So we're talking a lot of people. We're talking that the money that is going into the defense budget can be supplying jobs for people. There are alternatives, and it's not something that people of color can ignore, saying that someone else can take care of it. We have to start being involved also. So,
if I could just jump in for a minute. I remember at the organizing meeting, it was very early that we first discovered that someone had just brought to our meeting the fact that in 1590 in Seneca County, very close to where the Seneca Army Depot is, that women of the Iroquois Nation, which is a question you asked Karen about, gathered together to stop warring among the tribes. And we've just put that out on all our literature because at the time in that meeting it was just, you know, it was a very eerie kind of feeling to realize that not only were the Iroquois Nation in 1590, the women there were gathering for peace. That was a whole lot of what Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and the women in Seneca Falls in that whole area, and then also the Underground Railroad, that upstate New York, that particular area is just incredibly rich with women's history. And we intend to carry on that tradition this summer at Seneca Army Depot.
Well, now, is it true that this is where the missiles are being stored as their last place before they're going to be sent to Europe? So this is where they have to be stopped.
Well, one of the things is because it's such highly classified material, the line that we've gotten in the last 2 years, every newspaper reporter has gotten from the people at the depot itself, is that they will neither confirm nor deny the rumor. They'll neither confirm nor deny what's on the base. So now when we talk with the depot officials and they ask us, we hear a rumor that hundreds of women are coming there this summer, we say to them, we can neither confirm nor deny that rumor.
Well, are hundreds of women going? What is this peace encampment going to look like as far as you can imagine now? What does it mean?
We're not sure. As I said earlier, we had envisioned one thing, and I think that it's just grown into an incredibly much larger thing. We have purchased property in upstate New York. We have bought a 65-acre piece of property, which we're setting up about 200 or 300 very primitive campsites on, so that women can come from their hometowns and have a place to stay. However, it is real primitive camping, and we can only accommodate, I think, up to 600 women at any one time on that piece of land. We have planned that piece of land to be a safe place for women to gather, to have workshops. Only a small area of that land will be open to men, and we hope to have most of it just be for women and women camping with their children and continuing to do workshops and that kind of programming on the land.
At the same time, the Army Depot is about 1.5 miles down the road, and we hope to have a continuous presence at the depot, as well as many large demonstrations throughout the summer.
So going to the peace camp, for example, if a woman has a child, she doesn't have to decide to stay home because she's afraid of her child being in danger at some big demonstration, because there's a safe place for her and her child to be, and she doesn't even have to go the 1.5 miles down the road to the Army Depot. Is that correct?
Well, we hope that she would, that's the point of the protest, is to be at the Army Depot, although some women will come for the activities at the peace camp itself. The thing is that there's going to be a lot of direct action throughout the summer, civil disobedience at the base. Women will be there and we encourage that women come and protest in whatever form. What we wanted to do was create a place for women who didn't feel like that was the gesture that they wanted to take, that they would always feel, that they had a place that was safe, that legally would not be restricting them at all.
Thanks a lot. We have a wonderful tape now that we want to go to, and when we come back, we'll talk more about specifically what people can do in the Boston area and the other things that you want to say. This tape is a song by Holly Near and some beautiful photographs of the women's movement.
People, you have the warmth and the beauty in the light of the sun.
and the beauty in the light of the sun and the wind and the moon.
Welcome back. I think you agree with all of us that those were incredible photographs, and they were taken by a woman named Ellen Shube, who's joined us now in the studio. Ellen, what can I say? You must have been taking photographs for years of the women's movement.
I've had the good fortune to be able to document some of the growth of the resistance to nuclear power and weapons and the international movement for peace and disarmament. And when you say that you don't know how large it's going to be, I had the good fortune of being in South Dakota in the summer of 1980 when between 7,000 and 12,000 people formed a peace camp, an international gathering for survival, right next to Ellsworth Air Force Base, where they fly out B-52 bombers, which might be carrying the cruise missiles in the future unless we stop them. And people from 36 Indian nations and 26 countries around the globe gathered to talk about regional strategies for how to preserve our resources and stop the genocide that is being done at the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle, where our uranium and water is being abused, and Indian nations' treaty rights are being abused in the creation of nuclear weapons and waste. And I see this as an extension of that same struggle and the struggle that women have brought to the steps of the Pentagon. Some of these photographs, like this one over here, are from those actions when women tried to make a link between the expenditure of monies and the violence in women's lives and the need to change some of these priorities.
Well, your photographs are absolutely wonderful. I hear you're hoping to get them into book form soon. Is that...
I'm working on that, and I would like to go and be able to take some pictures of people in Europe who are on a daily basis taking up a piece of this struggle in their lives and understanding it very graphically, and be able to share that back with people here to encourage people to recognize that it's not just happening over there, that it's in our backyard that the weapons are being manufactured and produced and deployed unless we can stop them.
One gets the impression, looking at your photographs, that there are a lot of women from different classes and races in this country who are involved, but I don't hear about it much in the media. How strong do you think the women's peace movement is in the United States?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I think it is the task of this generation of women and feminists in particular to envision solutions to the problems that now exist. And to be able to envision peace and survival and fulfillment of our needs, and to change the priorities of this country. And if we are to ensure survival for future generations and all life, we have to stop the deployment of non-verifiable first-strike nuclear weapons, and we have about 6 months to do it. And that's why I think the Women's Encampment for Peace and Justice this summer is of critical importance, because it will create an atmosphere of affirmation and survival, and a forum in which we can strategize how we can go about stopping these weapons. And I also think that it's not only going to be happening there. There are lots of things that will be happening here in Boston which people can participate in, and already have been happening. We had a demonstration in solidarity with the International Women's Disarmament Day on May 24th. And we will be doing things throughout the summer in the Boston area, and there's a lot of work we have to do. There are plans that may bring the nuclear navy with cruise missiles to Boston Harbor. That decision is being made in July. There are numerous industries in the Boston area that are involved in manufacturing components that are part of the MX missile, which is also a first-strike missile. In fact, this June 20th, there is going to be a demonstration at the GT&E plant in Westboro, where people will be handing out some information and trying to let people know what's happening in our own backyards here. There are parts of the missiles being done by Raytheon and by Avco, and Draper Labs here in Cambridge is involved in doing some of the missile guidance systems. And there are many organizations in the Boston area who are actively involved in trying to help people educate themselves so that they can choose what to do in their daily lives that can help turn the tide around.
I think what you're bringing up, Ellen, is that there's so much happening with us right here in Boston that we have to do and continue to do. And what I really want to stress, and I feel that Nancy has a lot to say about local things that will happen, is that the Peace Encampment is one event. It's going to be one major event. But at the same time, it's part of a movement. As a movement that does not stop in September. It's something that we must continue on to do, that people are getting tired that so much money is going into the defense budget and taken away from social programs.
Last week they put $625 million to testing the first-strike missiles and building their basing modes. I think it's necessary for people to become involved in expressing themselves, so that this appropriations process doesn't just happen, that the government figures know what the people feel and want.
Well, Nancy, you're the person who knows the most about what's happening in Boston. We have very little time left, and I'm sorry to get to this point. Can you tell us quickly?
Sure. I think the most important thing is that this encampment needs to be used as a way for people to network and begin to organize, for women to begin to organize for disarmament, or to continue, I shouldn't say begin. And I think that in Boston particularly, one of our major concerns is outreach and educating people, not only about the Seneca Peace Encampment and the Seneca Army Depot, but the connections between issues of the budget, economic issues, and militarism, and how those are connected to women. And we have just opened an office in Boston, as a matter of fact, which will be a New England organizing office. And we hope that out of this office we will be able to both find ways to get women to Seneca, to the Peace Encampment during the summer, but also we're hoping to organize, as Ellen mentioned, local demonstrations in Boston, maybe at some of the local weapons facilities that Ellen had mentioned. July 4th is the opening day of the Peace Encampment, and that's a possibility for a local action. We haven't made decisions yet.
Local action. I mean, a lot will be happening right here in Boston throughout the summer.
So people don't have to go the 400 miles.
Right.
They can be just as involved and active here.
And just as important.
Right.
Just as very much needed here, just as much up in Seneca. Because
Right.
we need them to continue in Boston, greater Boston area, once again the encampment is over.
And I think that the way that the encampment will reach the greatest number of people is by there being small actions in many cities and towns across the country, support actions all summer long, so that people remember that this encampment is happening in Seneca.
Okay, we'd like to go now to another tape that we have showing women expressing their feelings about nuclear weapons.
When I was in 5th grade, I lived in Illinois with my family, and one night we went to a play at my grade school, and I remember I had left something in my locker, so during intermission I went through the corridor to get my locker, and I had to walk through the corridor past all these institutional green lockers, and it was completely empty, and I kept having a feeling that someone was behind me, or something was chasing me, or someone was looking over my shoulder, and it was a very frightening feeling. And that night, I remember I had a terrible nightmare about nuclear war. And I remember that whole incident, but it took several years later before I made the connection between feeling fearful in the familiar surroundings of my school and dreaming about nuclear war. It took a while before I realized what the threat was.
When I was younger and in grade school, I went to a parochial school that was chosen as an experiment, in a sense. The kids had to leave school and find out how long it took them to walk home, just in case there was a nuclear holocaust. And unfortunately, nobody ever thought of the fact, would the kids even get home walking that distance? Would there even be a home to walk to? But I remember skipping with other kids and running and stopping into the candy store on the way home, thinking it was great, but also having this really sense of doom, and hearing the sirens go off around the city. It was incredibly scary.
I was 10 when I remember going from playing with dolls to running into the woods and building bomb shelters, thinking that it was going to help my situation. My parents never built a bomb shelter, but my neighbor did, and it was my neighbor that gave me hope that a bomb shelter would save us. And I think in those days when I could have hope, and now I look at the generation who knows so much more than I do, and it makes me sad to think that they don't have hope because of all that they know, and that's about it.
I first remember really thinking about nuclear weapons when there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think I was about 9, and in summer school we had a mock UN where we represented different countries and discussed, what we would do, and I remember being very scared of the whole thing, and at the same time thinking that I couldn't understand how they would expect the Russians to move back from Cuba when we still had our missiles in bases in Turkey. And I remember, wishing that things could be worked out in the real UN or in the world governments the way we were working it out in this little mock UN. I think my son, who's about 5, is extremely sophisticated in a certain way in viewing these things, although, I know it's a very scary thing for kids. I think it's almost so overwhelmingly gruesome or overwhelmingly scary that, in a sense, you don't grasp it.
Together, if we're strong and united, we can fight them. We can say we don't want this. We want our lives, we want our choice, we want our children to live. And I think together we can do it.
Welcome back to the studio. We want to end our show tonight with a song from a wonderful woman named Susan Abbott, who's been singing in Germany, singing a song that was the favorite song recently among women's coffee houses and other places in Europe, and it's called Lies, Lies, Lies.
Well, I wrote this song about 2 years ago after I read an article on the front page of the Boston Globe in January where they were talking about the Federal Emergency Management Agency and giving us all these little hints about how we should evacuate, and you know that we should take our credit cards and our keys and our shovels and our picks and everything, and just prepare to take a little ride and commute, maybe 50 miles away, and then everything will be all right after that. And it really did inspire a song. A front page headline stopped me cold. It said, "Nuke war the end. Officials say no." Seems that some of Reagan's boys thinks it'll be okay if a missile or two came our way. I'm talking about lies, lies, lies. They're so busy lying, they won't notice that we're dying. Me, oh my, just tell me, should I laugh or cry? Now one fellow was quoted to say that after 2 to 4 years, or with proper civil defense, there's no need to fear. He says there's no chance of radiation disease, 'cause we're too sanitized and pasteurized to get the plague, if you please. I'm talking about lies, lies, lies. Well, they're so busy lying, they won't notice that we're dying. Me, oh my. Just tell me, should I laugh or cry? Ooh, well, he said, yes, we'd have some fatalities, but if we all did our part, you know, America would recover, 'cause it's written on a chart. Ooh, these figures are based on the Crimean War. That's the truth, huh? Most of them survived it. Need I say more about lies, 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 lies? They're so busy lying, they won't notice that we're dying. Ooh, me, oh my. Tell me, should I laugh or cry? Now, would the survivors envy those that were dead? Well, that's an overwhelming question. You won't believe what was said, sure, of course. But after the shock had worn, well, you know, we'd all pitch in to build it back to what it was like before. No, 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 no. Lies, lies, lies. They're so busy lying, they won't notice that we're dying, dying, dying. Woo, woo, me, oh my. Tell me, should I laugh or cry? Ooh, ooh. Now these boys hope to God that a war does not occur, but if it does, they know one thing for sure, that in all probability, if it happens once, my friend, well, you know, it will never, never, ever, 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 ever happen again. should I laugh or tell me? Well, should I